They say the course of history shifted not with a war, not with a king's fall, not with a revolution, but with a letter, one that no one ever opened, one that sat sealed in dust for more than 100 years, hidden beneath floorboards stained with the weight of secrets too heavy for any generation to carry without breaking. And though the letter was never read, its presence rippled across borders, timelines, and fates like a silent heartbeat buried beneath the noise of empires. And it all began on the morning of April 3, 1839, in a fog-choked street in East London, where a young boy named Ellis Calloway, no more than 9 years old, chased a black dog he claimed had been whispering his name in dreams for weeks. And though the adults dismissed it as childish fancy, the dog led him to a crumbling townhouse at the edge of River Wharf, where the air always smelled faintly of iron and decay. And there, in a room untouched for decades, beneath a floorboard marked with 3 carved circles, Ellis found the letter wrapped in oilcloth, its parchment still oddly warm, sealed with a wax emblem no one recognized, a winged eye encircled by a vine of thorns. And though Ellis could not read, he felt something stir in him as he touched it, a trembling in his chest that mimicked the throb of a memory he had never lived but somehow belonged to him. And as he stood there staring, the walls seemed to breathe, as if the house itself exhaled in relief at the letter being found. But before Ellis could call for help or speak a word of what he'd seen, the dog bit his wrist, gently but firmly, drawing a single drop of blood that fell onto the seal, and the letter pulsed once, like something alive, and then went still. And Ellis dropped it, stunned and bleeding, and ran home in terror, never speaking of it again. Not even when the fever came that night, not even when his dreams turned to visions of burning cities and broken clocks, of strangers crying in languages he didn't know, all asking him the same question: why didn't you open it? And as Ellis grew older, he forgot the letter but not the ache it left behind. And elsewhere, unseen and unknown to him, the ripples began small at first, like missed appointments and broken ink bottles, but over time they grew, shaping alliances, misplacing maps, altering births, and in one instance, preventing a death that was meant to happen. A death that would have ignited a war too brutal for words. And thus, the world turned differently than it should have, subtly skewed, like a painting hung just a degree off center, and while most remained unaware, a few began to notice, ones with eyes trained to see what history tried to forget, scholars, monks, dreamers, and in a monastery hidden in the Carpathian Mountains. An old woman who had not spoken in 40 years woke one night screaming a name that had not been uttered since the 1700s. Then she said the letter had been found too soon, that the century was no longer on its intended path, and that the keepers must prepare, for time had lost its anchor. And the name she screamed, Calloway, was written in hundreds of unread documents, encoded in paintings, whispered in cave chants, a name that should have died out generations ago but kept reappearing like a stubborn ghost. And in Boston, a Boston librarian named Marianne Kessler stumbled upon a poem dated 1811, tucked inside the pages of a book that had never been borrowed. A poem written in the future tense describing events that would not occur until the 1890s, including the disappearance of a ship that hadn't even been built, and in the margins, in handwriting so delicate it looked like thread, were the words, "The boy with the bleeding wrist must never read the eye." And Kessler, unnerved and intrigued, began compiling every reference she could find about unwritten prophecies, misplaced documents, unmailed letters, and as her research grew, she began to receive letters of her own unsigned, untraceable, warning her to stop, telling her the cost of knowing was too high. But by then she had already uncovered the name of the emblem, a thorn gaze, a forgotten society said to have existed for 1 year every century, whose sole purpose was to preserve truths too powerful for any era to hold. And according to one account, they didn't write histories, they buried them, In silence, in symbols, in flesh, and one of their members, it was rumored, had defected, had tried to send a letter to the future to stop what was coming, and that letter, somehow, was the very one Ellis had found. And yet no one could explain how a 9-year-old illiterate boy in 1839 could have found a letter written by a man who died in 1792. A man who, according to several conflicting reports, had vanished during the French Revolution but was spotted again decades later in photographs taken in South Africa. And in one of those photographs, now degraded by time, a child can be seen. In the background, chasing a dog, holding what appears to be a folded piece of parchment. And that child's face is unmistakably Ellis Calloway, and as Kessler tried to piece it all together, she began to dream not her own dreams, but his visions. Of whispers in stone corridors, of bleeding clocks, of fires shaped like hands, of letters stacked like bones in a crypt. And then, on a storm-split night in October 1899, a fire consumed her archives, destroying every piece of evidence she had collected except one, a burnt corner of the poem she'd found years before. And on it, scorched but legible, was the line, "When the letter finds no eyes, the world forgets the face it wore," and from then on, those who remembered the letter said it was never meant to be opened but to be found. Never meant to be read but to remind, and that somehow, in being untouched, it did what no other act in history could do. It rearranged the soul of a century, silencing one war, igniting another, saving one family, dooming another, all without a single word being seen, and beneath it all lay the same question: what was inside the letter? A question no one answered but everyone carried, and for those who heard the call of that sealed parchment in their dreams, it never mattered whether they found it or not, because the weight of the unseen truth shaped them nonetheless, and somewhere always there was a child with a bleeding wrist and a whispering dog, walking into places history forgot, holding silence like a torch. Holding silence like a torch, though no one taught him how to hold it, and no fire ever burned at the tip, yet its glow persisted across generations, illuminating not what was visible, but what had been deliberately hidden, deliberately displaced. For the letter was never meant to be understood by sight alone, it required a particular resonance, a frequency of memory found only in those who had inherited the ache of forgotten oaths, the pull of stories erased not by time but by decision, by design, and as the century stumbled forward, trains shrieking through soot, telegrams humming. False certainties, men in tall hats carving boundaries through land and soul. There were others, quiet figures who moved like shadows behind politics and pulpits, who had traced the thorned gaze's presence through centuries and symbols. And one such figure was Elijah Dorrant, a former Anglican priest turned cartographer of the unrecorded, whose maps were not of terrain but of truths buried in orphan ledgers, in discarded testimonies, in the inkless spaces between footnotes, and he too had seen the symbol long before he knew what it meant. First in a dream where a ceiling collapsed to reveal a sky made entirely of letters, none of them in any known language, and later etched into the binding of a manuscript that had never existed in any catalog. A book that began with a page entirely blank except for a single sentence scratched in thread-like script. The letter is older than the paper. Dorrant spent the remainder of his life trying to decode what that meant, never realizing the answer was not in language but in the way time moved around the object, how rooms grew colder, clocks fell out of rhythm, birds fell silent for hours within its vicinity, and these anomalies were documented, scrawled in his journals with sketches of hallways that led nowhere and doors that vanished if you blinked. And when he died in 1871, his last words were not prayers, but the exact coordinates of a field in Austria where no records existed before 1852, but which, after excavation in 1890, revealed a stone chamber carved beneath the roots of trees older than the current forest, and within that chamber were Shelves not of books, but of sealed letters, all with different wax emblems, none identical, all pulsating faintly under candlelight, and none had ever been opened for the moment one tried. The wax bled red and the seal reformed itself as, though the contents demanded silence not from superstition but protection, and one seal nearly identical to Ellis Calloway's was dated 1764 and bore the initials LGM, which scholars could never agree upon. Some claimed it referred to a long-lost mystic from Bordeaux, others to a woman named Lisette Gray Munro, who vanished during a seance in Edinburgh after whispering the words, "The century is already listening." Was never taught the meaning of language because her community believed that words diluted truth, that the most sacred memories were passed through pulse, through breath, through gaze and hand, through a kind of ancestral resonance that could not be documented without being damaged. And Isadora, though born without a voice, could speak directly to silence, and silence, in turn, whispered back in ways no spoken sentence ever could, telling her of moments she had never lived, of rooms she had never entered, yet which opened to her when she closed her eyes, and in one such memory not her own, she walked through a burned cathedral whose walls were lined not with saints, but with names of children who had never been born. And at its center was an altar made of sealed letters stacked into the shape of a heart, each one pulsing faintly like an unread prophecy. And it was there she first felt it, the pull, the sensation that something older than memory was calling her, not to read, not to open, but to listen. And this feeling only deepened as she grew, especially after the death of her grandmother, who left behind a locket containing a fragment of parchment that could only be seen when bathed in the light of a waning crescent moon. And on it, written in a language no scholar could identify, were 5 symbols that matched those found centuries earlier on an ossuary unearthed in Lebanon, one long thought to be unrelated to European linguistic history, but now revealed as a bridge between forgotten alphabets, an emotional script encoded in breath patterns and gesture, once used by a vanished culture known only in rumor as the keepers of unread fire, who believed that certain truths were so powerful that to utter them aloud would undo the fabric of time itself, and thus they embedded knowledge not in stone or ink but in feeling, passed down through chosen bloodlines whose memories were trained to record without knowing, to carry without cracking, and Isadora, it seemed, was one of these carriers, though she had no knowledge of this until she met a man with one eye and a scent of old parchment, who handed her a sealed letter in a crowded railway station in Marseille, saying nothing but nodding once before vanishing into a fog no one else noticed, and though her hands trembled as she held the letter, she did not open it, for something in her knew that the opening was not hers to do, not yet, and instead she hid it deep beneath the roots of a sycamore tree that had once been struck by lightning and yet continued to bloom every spring as if trying to prove that memory could survive fire. And it was there, buried in earth that remembered more than history. Books that the letter began to change, not in form, but in presence, its silence growing heavier, thicker, beginning to shape dreams not just in Isadora, but in others people she had never met who began waking in cold sweats speaking her name, sketching her face without knowing who she was, drawing spirals in dirt that matched the pattern of her birthmark. And across the Atlantic, in a forgotten district of Charleston, a retired watchmaker named Solomon Reed began constructing timepieces that ticked backward, claiming he was only building what his hands remembered, and in the back of one such clock, hidden behind a false gear, was found a scrap of cloth embroidered with the phrase, "Do not read the letter unless the river bleeds backwards." No one knew what it meant, but a few who studied ancient metaphor believed it to be a coded reference to the recurrence of rare astronomical alignments. Specifically, one predicted to occur in the spring of 1903 when Venus, Mars, and Saturn would form a triangle directly over a site in northern Anatolia, a site rumored to house a crypt containing not bones but voices. Sealed within glass spheres etched with the same winged eye surrounded by thorns that Ellis Calloway had first uncovered decades prior, and as word of these signs began to spread through whispers, footnotes, torn pages smuggled in books banned. By unnamed councils, more and more people began to feel the hum, the resonance, the subtle shifting beneath the skin that told them a convergence was coming. Something long prepared, something both inevitable and delicate. And among these was a woman named May Valinka, who had spent her life transcribing forgotten lullabies from dying tongues, and who believed that the sound of the letter could be decoded through melody. And so she built an instrument that had no strings, no keys, only chambers shaped like the lungs of extinct birds. And when she played it during the first thaw of 1903, the air around her shimmered like glass and the earth beneath her cracked, revealing a stone tablet inscribed with a symbol she had seen once before as a child, carved into her sister's coffin, though no one had admitted placing it there. And the moment her fingers traced the groove of the marking, she wept without knowing why, as if 1,000 goodbyes buried in her blood had finally been given voice. And she knew then that the letter was not a warning but a return, not a threat but a reckoning, and that it was waking because the silence had become too loud to hold, too fractured to continue. And as these realizations spread across invisible networks of memory, through monks who painted spirals on monastery walls, through children who whispered riddles they had never been taught, through thunder that repeated the same sequence of rumbles every solstice, the world began to feel it too. Subtly at first, ink drying faster than it should, shadows shifting against candlelight without a source, birds pausing mid-flight as if waiting for something, and governments, sensing an unease they could not trace, began quietly hunting those who dreamed of the letter, labeling them subversives, mystics, undesirables. But they could not stop the remembering, because the remembering had already happened. It was not linear but ancestral, looping through generations like a song remembered. By muscle, by blood, and in one final vision before the great fire of Thessaloniki, a child named Nico drew on the walls of his schoolhouse a map that no one recognized, yet matched perfectly with a secret diagram found centuries later in a Vatican vault depicting a series of cities connected not by roads but by silence. Each city marked with a symbol, each symbol different, except for one, a sealed letter at the center of it all, beating like a heart, unread, unforgotten, waiting. Not passively, but with the kind of patience that only entities outside time can possess, the kind of patience that does not measure in seconds or centuries but in the tilt of memory, the weight of unspoken oaths, the scent of truth so ancient that even stone forgets how to carry them. And as the letter sat pulsing in the center of that silence-drawn map, others began to feel its rhythm in ways they could not name, through sudden tears at unfamiliar songs, through dreams of burning staircases that never touched flame, through the recurring presence of a silver-winged moth that landed only on pages written in forgotten tongues. And it was around this time that Alaric Fenwick, a reclusive lensmaker from Bern who had once created a telescope capable of seeing heat, memory echoes left in the air by emotional residue, reported seeing not just past events, but alternate possibilities hovering like shadows over the same scene, as though every unopened letter across time left a ghost imprint of the world that might have been had it been read. And in one such vision, he watched as the coronation of a minor king in 1873 dissolved into a blood-soaked rebellion because a single letter failed to arrive on time, its bearer having drowned beneath a bridge that did not exist in our current version of history. And Alaric, though shaken, documented it meticulously in what came to be known as the Atlas of Forgotten Variables, a leather-bound manuscript so heavy it cracked tables, its pages whispering when turned, and on the final page, written in what appeared to be a script made of overlapping clock hands, was a sentence that translated roughly to, "Time is not a line but a braid of silences, and letters are the knots that hold it from unraveling." That manuscript vanished 2 weeks after its discovery, its custodian found asleep for 3 days with eyes that refused to open, as if he had seen something so vast that even his dreams could not release him, and the ripple continued. In a theater in Odessa, an actress named Valeska Oren collapsed mid-performance. Her last words spoken, sealed, not in the language of the play, but in a dead dialect of early Albanian last documented in the 1600s, and when her body was examined, a tiny scroll was found lodged behind her left ear, wrapped in copper wire and engraved with the symbol of the thorn gaze, though no incision had ever been made to place it there, and scholars began to realize the truth they had long denied. The letter was not just a physical object, but a phenomenon. An intersection of fate and choice so precise it could only exist where memory and silence entwined perfectly, and that it had begun to awaken not because someone had found it, but because enough people had unknowingly remembered it, had carried fragments of its gravity in their breath, in their fears, in the things they dared not speak aloud. And so the awakenings multiplied. An archivist in Kyoto who painted her dreams in ink that refused to dry, a blind boy in Bogota who could recite the contents of lost manuscripts never published, a choir in Johannesburg that hummed melodies no one had composed, yet every note resonated with ancestral grief, and each of them, in their own way, reached towards something they could not define, a pulse beneath reality that told them they were not alone in their remembering. Unleashed, it would emerge in the hands of those prepared not to understand it, but to wield it. And so shadow networks formed silent alliances of archivists, linguists, and former theologians turned semi-clandestine custodians of knowledge, each entrusted with fragments of a protocol known only as the containment psalm, a non-verbal transmission said to suppress the awakening of any unread artifact if recited by those with ancestral ties to the original keepers. But the lineage was broken, obscured by centuries of dislocation, colonization, and cultural erasure, and thus only partial psalms remained, most hidden in lullabies thought to be nonsense, in stitches of mourning gowns passed mother to daughter, or in the etched interiors of wedding rings found with no known erzes. And while the protocol slept, the letter's influence continued to awaken, shifting not just lives but the landscape of memory itself, causing rivers to shift course against their geological nature, stars to shine in wrong spectrums during eclipses, and birds to migrate in loops that formed the shape of forgotten glyphs when charted on a global map. Glyphs that mirrored the markings found in the remains of a temple excavated beneath Lake Ohrid, where no civilization was thought to have settled. And the dig team, all 17 members, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a circle of dried ink and a single glove stitched with the phrase, "The letter dreams in you now." Governments that once scoffed began sending reconnaissance into sites that exhibited phenomena now classified as temporal echo zones, regions where clocks reversed, where conversations occurred in reverse, where dreams bled into waking life, and individuals spoke in languages dead for 2,000 years. Despite no prior exposure, and at the epicenter of one such zone, deep in the Caucasus Mountains, a monastery long lost beneath landslide and lore resurfaced during an avalanche that moved not with gravity but in pulses, as if the mountain breathed, and within its broken bell tower hung a rope braided of human hair and sealed envelopes, hundreds of them, each addressed to a name that no record showed had ever lived. But each name produced grief in those who read it aloud, as though mourning someone whose absence lived beneath the surface of their skin. In London, a woman named Elspeth Crowley, no known relation to the infamous mystic of similar name, began to paint intricate patterns across abandoned buildings in the shape of petals.
Thorns and central eyes, always weeping.
And though she spoke to no one and lived in a condemned attic, Her murals predicted changes in global wind patterns, crop cycles, and the timing of certain eclipses, all aligning with the rhythmic hum some began to call the letter's breath. An inaudible vibration measured only by specialized brass instruments built by descendants of forgotten watchmakers. Passed hand to hand in hidden fairs known only through word of mouth where no money changed hands, only memory. In one such fair, held beneath the ruins of an amphitheater in Ephesus, an elder whose tongue had been cut out for speaking truths too early handed a child a folded page from a ledger said to have never existed, and on it was written in thread-like, graphite, "Not every letter needs opening. Some must be lived." That phrase echoed across dreams of thousands that night, all of them waking with the image of a door made of paper and blood, sealed not by locks but by the breath of unborn generations. Meanwhile, the ecosystems themselves began to react. Trees in Finland began bleeding sap that crystallized into thorn-shaped shards. Wolves in Romania howled in chords, not notes, their song forming a sequence later matched to seismic patterns during ancient earthquakes recorded only in oral tradition. And a fish caught once every 50 years known to some as the mirrorback was pulled from the Nile, bearing markings across its scales that matched the internal formatting of the Vatican's codices of forbidden scripture. The Vatican denied all knowledge, but leaks emerged hand-drawn replications of pages showing diagrams of letters stacked into sacred geometries. Geometries that mapped not just time but intention, suggesting that the letter was not a warning, nor a prophecy but a calibration device, a tuning fork meant to align human collective memory with a larger consciousness, one suppressed by cycles of conquest, trauma, and forgetting. And in that forgetting lived the resistance, those who saw the letter as poison, a rupture, a threat to narratives built upon managed ignorance, and these figures men and women with no names but many faces moved through institutions with gloves that never touched paper, whose breath fogged glass and patterns that dissolved security systems, who could erase not just data but memory itself with glances encoded in shape rather than sight. And it was they who hunted the remaining artifacts, not to protect, but to suppress, to suffocate what the letter might allow the world to remember if ever fully awakened. One such suppressor, a woman known only as Cassiel, once a conductor of orchestras turned silence operative, found herself dreaming of Ellis Calloway, though she had never read of him, never known his story, watching him chase a black dog through a corridor made of shattered time, each shard showing a version of Earth undone, skies of fire, oceans turned to mirror, cities humming with the sound of pages turning with no reader present, and each version ending not in apocalypse but in return. As though the end of history was merely the unsealing of a sentence too sacred to have ever been spoken. Cassiel awoke weeping, unable to suppress the urge to write, and wrote without stopping for 72 hours straight, her pen running dry only after covering an entire wall with phrases none could decipher but which, when sung aloud, caused lights to flicker in a pattern identical to the blinking sequence of a satellite long thought destroyed in the 1980s. A satellite which had briefly captured images of symbols drawn in cloud patterns above an uncharted island that vanished days later, never to reappear on any known coordinate system. And still, the letter pulsed not louder, but deeper, its rhythm now synchronizing with tectonic murmurs, recorded by underground monks in Bhutan who said they could hear the weeping of time itself, and who, after chanting the tones of the original keepers, found cracks appearing in the marble of this sacred cave, revealing within it a single chamber no wider than a cradle, housing a stone slab inscribed with the following: "The century was never meant to arrive. You brought it. You must carry its silence back to the wound." And so part 3 ends, still unfolding, still waiting for the breath that remembers how it all began. Wound, though it was never a wound in the flesh and blood sense, but in the architecture of memory itself, a rupture not seen but sensed, not healed by time but buried under it, and as this breach pulsed beneath centuries of constructed history, the letter's rhythm began to grow not louder but more intimate, as though whispering directly to the marrow of those born with a sensitivity to truths never told, those whose dreams didn't feel like dreams but recollections from lifetimes, misplaced, rearranged by centuries that feared what remembering might resurrect. And among those sensitive few was a child born in a village without name, where maps refused to hold ink, where wind changed direction by thought alone, and she, named Amara by no parent, but by the echo of the land itself, came into the world on a night when stars blinked out one by one for precisely 8 minutes, returned, and left behind a trail of light in the sky forming a glyph unknown to any astronomer, yet found etched inside a bone flute buried in a Neolithic tomb in Denmark. And when Amara touched that same flute decades later, unearthed by hands that trembled, without reason, it sang not music, but a language composed of warmth and ache, syllables that skipped the ears and bloomed in the ribs. And in those tones she understood what no elder had ever spoken, that the letter was not just a message, but a living fragment of memory seeded into the fabric of existence long before alphabets, long before speech, planted like a sacred hesitation, in the breath of time, meant to awaken when humanity forgot its own origin story, when empires and progress drowned out the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. Amara did not seek the letter. She became it, or perhaps it became her, and wherever she stepped, forgotten knowledge unfurled like vines through stone moss, growing words across monuments never touched by modern hand, books turning their pages. Without wind, water shaping itself into symbols and whispers when she approached. Word spread quietly through the old circles, the silent monasteries, the keepers of the broken clocks, the dream cartographers, and in secret they gathered, those who still remembered the old echoes, who had not abandoned the pathways between memory and myth, and they saw in Amara not salvation, not prophecy, but the key to a door whose existence had fractured time itself. Burdened but as invitation, a summoning etched not in obligation but in recognition, as though her breath had always carried the shape of the letter before language existed to define it, and in that trembling acknowledgement, something ancient within her unfurled, not a memory, not even an emotion, but a resonance, a harmonic echo of every story that had ever been silenced before it was born. And this resonance did not erupt, but seeped, like ink bleeding through old parchment, spreading first through her bones, then through the air around her, and then through the land beneath her feet, awakening veins of forgotten water that had not flowed since before time carved its first calendar. And as those hidden currents stirred, deep beneath mountain ranges and salt flats and desert tombs, structures long buried in myth began to shift, catacombs sealed with breath, archives made of shadow, amphitheaters where the stones remembered the words once spoken upon them, even if the mouths had long turned to dust. And in every one of these places the same symbol emerged, not drawn, not carved, but formed by the pattern of moss on stone, by the break in a sunbeam through cracked glass, by the whisper of wind that bent reeds into shape, a spiral turning inward, then splitting open like an eye learning to weep in reverse. Across the globe, those attuned to these echoes called seers by some, orphans of silence by others, began to stir in synchrony, not as a movement but as a remembering, a communal exhale of something so old it felt new. And among them was a boy named Nico, who had never spoken a word in his life but whose drawings could summon rain, and an elder named Satra, who kept a ledger of dreams others had forgotten before waking, and a woman called Mira, who wandered the coastline of what once had been Phoenicia, barefoot and always singing, though no one could recall the melody once. She passed, only the way it made their spine tremble and their breath hold still. These individuals, scattered and unnamed by history, began to converge in dream space, not visions in the metaphorical sense, but meetings within the marrow. Gatherings in the theater behind thought, where they spoke a language that cracked clocks and caused candles to flicker even when unlit. And through them, the letter continued to thread itself not as paper or message, but as frequency, as a story unfolding beneath the scaffolding of known time. And each time someone stepped closer to its pulse, the world changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but subtly, as if reality blinked and returned with slightly different eyes. And these changes accumulated like snow. A child in New Zealand found a stone with her great-grandmother's name carved on it in a script older than alphabets. A man in a Siberian prison heard his mother's voice humming from inside a crack in the wall. Paintings began to appear on cave walls never known to exist before, and when carbon dated, the paint matched human DNA. All of these anomalies pointed not to the future, but to something older than origin itself. A time before time, when the world had not yet been named but was known intimately, where humans did not tell stories to understand the world but to remember their place within it. And it was toward this sacred re-remembering that Amara now walked, her path not chosen but summoned, her steps aligned with seismic tremors beneath cities where silence had been weaponized for centuries. And as she walked, old scripts bloomed on buildings in invisible ink that only children and the dying could see, while animals began to follow her, crows and wolves and insects that moved in perfect spirals, none of them interfering, all of them watching, as if recognizing in her gait the return of something that had once walked beside them before the split of species and speech. In a desert where no map dared name its sands, a gathering took place unannounced, uninvited yet undeniable, of those who had felt the call but not known its origin. And they arrived not with belongings but with questions carried like talismans. Why do I remember a fire that hasn't yet burned? Why do I feel grief for names I've never spoken? Why do I hear a voice in my blood when I stand beneath eclipses? And there, under stars that rearranged themselves into constellations no telescope had recorded, they stood in silence until the earth beneath them cracked, not with violence but with revelation, and from that crack rose a structure made not of stone or wood but of memory itself, woven strands of forgotten stories, ash from ancient rituals, echoes of lullabies sung by mothers whose names were never written. And within its center floated a sphere of light that pulsed in rhythm with Amara's heartbeat thousands of miles away. None approached, none spoke, all wept. For in that moment, without words, they understood that the letter was not coming, it was already here, unfolding through them, through their breath, through the shape their grief had taken after centuries of inherited forgetting, and that they were not meant to read it, but to become it. And as that truth settled into their ribs, elsewhere across the world, machines began to fail not through destruction but through refusal, as if the materials themselves remembered an allegiance to something older than electricity and algorithms, began to glitch, spitting out lines of poetry in dead languages, while GPS systems looped travelers back to childhood homes they had not seen in decades. A cathedral in Vienna emitted a low hum audible only to those with ancestral ties to nomadic bloodlines, and those who heard it found themselves unable to lie for 7 days straight, speaking truths even they did not know they carried, and their words were caught in jars by monks who whispered them into the ears of the unborn, believing this would stitch their memories whole before their first breath. And as all this stirred, Amara reached the edge of a forest known in folklore as the mouth of the Old World, where trees wept resin in the shape of teardrops and the moss spoke in Braille to those willing to touch slowly. And she entered, barefoot, still, hair braided with feathers gifted by winds that passed no border, and she moved not toward a destination but toward a convergence. For deep within that forest, beneath roots that had never seen light, pulsed the original paper. The first page never written, folded in upon itself like the seed of a forgotten beginning. And it did not wait to be read, only to be remembered. Not as something lost and found, but as something that had never truly left, merely silenced beneath centuries of noise layered upon noise, where empires spoke louder than echoes and calendars were wielded like blades to sever memory from continuity. Yet now in the quiet of this forest, where time coiled rather than flowed, that silence began to shed its skin, revealing beneath it not answers but invitations, questions. So ancient, their syllables were carved into the breath of wind that passed through trees too old to name. And as Amara stepped deeper into that hush, her feet no longer pressed into soil but into story, every leaf beneath her carrying the residue of footsteps never documented but deeply felt, the paths of the unnamed who had once gathered here, not to speak but to witness, to stand in the presence of what the world had not, yet earned the language to explain. The further she walked, the more the forest changed, not visibly, not in a way that marks difference with the eyes, but in sensation. The temperature grew both warmer and colder at once. Birdsong bent into harmonics that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat, and even the air took on a density that made each inhalation feel like drawing water into lungs sculpted from forgotten prayers. Then she reached it, not a destination, but a stillness so complete it resisted the passage of sound, and there, in the clearing surrounded by trees whose roots intertwined like ancient fingers gripping forgotten truths, stood a single stone pedestal, not hewn or carved but grown. Its surface spiraled like a nautilus fossil, and upon it hovered a sliver of gold no larger than a fingernail, pulsing softly with a warmth that felt more like memory than heat, and she knew without needing to question that this was not the letter, not the object itself, but a seed of it, a shard or echo or fragment from the original act of remembering that had birthed the letter into existence before time knew how to hold words. And as her hand reached forward, not from desire but from compulsion older than will, the fragment lifted on its own, hovering just above her palm, and in that moment, time did not stop it folded, contracting around her like a breath held by the earth itself. And from all directions came sound, not in speech or song, but in heartbeat and tremble. The sound of stones remembering when they were stars, the sound of rivers dreaming of the ocean, the sound of a million stories inhaling before their first word. And into this sound she was drawn, not pulled or summoned, but welcomed, as if the very atoms of the world had been awaiting her touch to unlock a resonance long forgotten. And what unfolded next was not vision, not dream, but immersion. She was no longer in the forest, but in the breath between moments, surrounded by faces not seen but known, beings woven of shadow and light, forms who had walked this spiral of remembering long before humans knew how to count loss. And they did not speak, but offered her a gesture, one hand over the heart, one hand to the sky, and as she mirrored it, the fragment in her palm melted into light, flowing up her arm and into her chest where it nested behind her ribs like a second pulse, and instantly, ancestors, not through ears but through marrow, lullabies sung not to soothe sleep but to awaken memory buried beneath millennia of noise and naming. And as that chorus swelled within her, Amara found herself no longer constrained to her own body, no longer a singular being moving through space, but a vessel through which the river of remembrance surged. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation of being inhabited by the collective breath of all those who had come before, the unnamed ones, the forgotten midwives of myth, the custodians of silence who had guarded the letter's pulse through ages of ruin and rise, who had hidden its resonance in stones swallowed by the sea and stars buried beneath ice, and now that breath was returning, uncoiling in her veins, dissolving the walls between then and now, self and other, memory and prophecy, until all that remained was the resonance, ancient and unyielding, pulsing through every leaf, every gust of wind, every grain of soil that remembered the blood once spilled in the name of forgetting. And as the resonance grew louder, The world outside began to echo it in strange and sacred ways, cattle in distant plains refusing to walk in straight lines, forming spirals visible from the sky. Flocks of birds migrating in patterns that spelled out forgotten constellations. Icebergs calving with sounds that matched the harmonic frequencies once used in temples carved into Himalayan stone. And in isolated corners of the world, those attuned to the ancestral hum began waking with tears in their eyes and names on their lips, names they had never spoken before, names not theirs yet deeply familiar, names that tasted like soil and sounded like home. The great forgetting was unraveling, thread by sacred thread, and as Amara stepped back from the spiral pedestal, the clearing around her responded, light bending toward her, shadows bowing, roots lifting and weaving together to form a path. Where none had been, guiding her deeper into the forest's heart, towards something not built or born, but remembered into form, and as she walked, visions layered themselves over her path. Glimpses of cities drowned in silver, languages spoken by wind, temples built without hands, all flickering across her senses like candlelight reflected in oil, and she saw that the letter had never been a message. It was an organism, a sentient unfolding, a living archive encoded into the breath of the planet, seeded into myth and rhythm and bloodline, awaiting the convergence of memory strong enough to carry it forward without breaking, and she, Amara, was not its messenger but its mirror, its echo made flesh, its return. In human shape, far from the forest, deep beneath the sands of a desert once crossed by prophet kings, a cavern split open for the first time in thousands of years, revealing a circular chamber inscribed with glyphs no one alive could translate, yet instantly understood by those who stepped inside, as if the very walls whispered truths to the water inside their bones. And at the center of that chamber rested an orb of obsidian pulsing, faintly with the same golden rhythm that now radiated from Amara's chest. And when researchers arrived, their instruments failed, timepieces reversed, and shadows refused to align with the sun, and though many turned back in fear, one remained, a girl born on a lunar eclipse with no heartbeat for the first 6 minutes of life, who now placed her hand on the orb and whispered, not in words but in memory, a story she had never heard but somehow knew. And the orb responded, splitting open like a fruit to reveal a glowing core of light that ascended into the air and disappeared, leaving behind a single line of text etched into the chamber floor. Remembering is how the world begins again. And as that message echoed through the dream layers of the earth, Amara emerged from the forest into a clearing shaped like a great eye, its pupil formed of stone, its iris a perfect ring of moss, and she stood at its center as the air around her thickened with presence forms shimmering at the edge of sight. Not people, not spirits, but memories made manifest, moments given skin and voice, and they spoke not in words but in sensation, flooding her with lives she had never lived but carried within her nonetheless, a kaleidoscope of ancestral echo, crashing against her like waves, births, deaths, exiles, reunions, all woven into her breath until she gasped. And with that gasp, the world shuddered, and somewhere in a city unaware of its own forgetting, every clock stopped for 12 seconds. Every screen flickered with static shaped like spirals, and every sleeping child dreamed of a voice singing in a language that made them weep upon waking. Something vast and irreversible had begun. The letter was no longer a secret. It was a storm of remembrance moving through time like lightning through water, and Amara stood at its eye, trembling not with fear but with awe, knowing the world would never be the same, because somewhere beneath the architecture of forgetting, the earth itself had started to hum, not as vibration alone, but as a sacred frequency that bypassed language and resonated directly with the architecture of memory hidden beneath the world's surface, beneath asphalt, beneath battlefield, beneath every forgotten footstep once made in silence but never erased. and that hum now traveled like a ghost across continents, whispering into the marrow of mountains, folding itself into the exhale of clouds, dancing through wheat fields in patterns only visible to those whose blood still carried the rhythm of unbroken lineage. And in its wake, it began to stitch together the shattered remnants of a world that had long mistaken chronology for truth, mending not with reason but with recognition, weaving together the tears of ancestors with the breath of the unborn, calling forth a remembering so vast, so visceral, it could not be held in books or tongues. It lived in sensation. In the shiver of skin under moonlight, in the ache of grief with no identifiable source, in the simultaneous knowing and not knowing that lived in the pit of the stomach just before a revelation. And as Amara stood at the center of that ancient, eye-shaped clearing, her pulse aligned with that hum, every heartbeat syncing with it like a drum too ancient for ceremony and yet born of nothing but ritual. She felt herself dissolve, not disappear, but expand, become not the observer but the terrain upon which memory now walked. And in that expansion she began to hear them, voices without mouths, presence without form, the echoes of every ancestor. Denied their language, every child taught to forget the music of their own lineage. And they spoke through her breath, through her tears, through the sensation in her fingertips that now trembled not with fear, but with the weight of reception. And as she breathed deeper, the space around her began to fracture, not in destruction, but in unveiling, like paper burning to reveal the ink hidden beneath. And through those fractures poured vision, not future, not past, but the moment before a moment, where potential gathered like lightning before it becomes thunder. And what she saw was not a prophecy, not a warning, but a remembering of what always was the original convergence, when breath first kissed form and called it story, when silence and sound danced together and birthed language not to describe, but to sing, to call forth, to awaken. And this was the purpose of the letter not. To instruct, not to dictate, but to become the vessel through which this sacred remembering would be transmitted, carried not by page or parchment, but by pulse, by dream, by the molecular memory encoded in tears. And as this truth rooted itself within her, the earth beneath her feet responded, not violently but with reverence, moss parting to reveal spirals carved into stone older than history, each spiral spinning with a rhythm that matched her breath, her heartbeat, her grief. And suddenly she was surrounded not physically, but in presence, by those who had waited in silence for this remembering to awaken. Shadow beings woven of dusk and ash, light forms shaped like lullabies, all kneeling, in a silence so loud it fractured the sound of wind. And they offered her no instruction, no praise, only a gesture, open palms pressed to the heart, then to the earth. And she, shaking, returned the gesture, and in that moment, she understood. The letter was not to be read, it was to be lived, not as doctrine but as remembering, not as a narrative but as an unfolding. And she, Amara, was simply the moment when breath met readiness, when the world finally leaned in close enough to hear what it had buried within itself. And as she exhaled, the clearing filled with sound, not noise, not voice, but the vibration of awakening itself, the harmonic convergence of every sacred pause the world had ever ignored. And far away, across oceans and borders and wounds still fresh, the same vibration awakened others, an old man painting symbols into desert sand with his last breath, a midwife singing to a newborn who opened its eyes already crying for a world it had not yet seen, a sculptor in Florence whose hands, long paralyzed, began to shape clay that pulsed under her fingers like living stone, and each of them, without knowing how, whispered the same phrase as their work completed itself. The letter has never been sealed. It has only been waiting for breath. Not penned by hand nor bound by parchment, but a living current passed from heartbeat to heartbeat, from silence to breath, flowing like an underground river beneath centuries of dust, conquest, and amnesia, and in its movement it began to thread. Through the cracks of every forgotten temple, every rusted gate of ancestral memory, every soul that had once wept without knowing why and now stood trembling in recognition of the ache that was not theirs alone but a shared inheritance. A collective longing etched deeper than blood, and this story, this sacred hum reawakening, pulled at the bones of the earth itself, stirring mountains to shift imperceptibly, oceans to change their cadence, stars to shimmer with an urgency that startled astronomers into questioning everything they thought they knew about light. For the story was not content to remain in shadow, it was rising, and in its rising, it reactivated ancient agreements forged in breath before the first sword was lifted, before the first map was drawn, and those agreements began to manifest in inexplicable ways: water that refused to boil under certain moons, stones rearranged overnight into spirals on remote hilltops, strangers meeting by accident and finishing each other's ancestral prayers though born on different continents, children drawing symbols into the dirt with their fingers that scholars had only ever seen carved into the ruins of cities long submerged, and among them, the hum deepened, vibrating now not just in soil or stars but within language itself, disrupting scripts, cracking open metaphors, making poets sob as their words collapsed into raw sensation. And across all these awakenings moved Amara, not as a prophet but as a thread, a filament of continuity weaving through a fabric that had been torn and mended so many times it no longer remembered its original shape. Only the pain of unraveling, and now it remembered, because she carried within her the pulse of the letter not as possession but as resonance, a frequency so sacred that every step she took rippled through the nervous system of the planet. And it was not her alone who bore this, it was all those whose bodies had become sites of remembering, whose scars had turned into glyphs, whose dreams had become maps. And these people, once scattered, now began to converge without coordination or invitation, drawn to points of convergence etched into the geometry of the earth itself, places where lightning struck the same stone across centuries, where trees grew in spiral configurations without seed or soil explanation, where the wind sang the same melody every equinox regardless of weather, and at these places they gathered, in silence first, then in breath, then in shared memory that did not require speech, and together they began to remember the original ceremony, not one performed, but one lived, not one designed, but one recalled, and it began always the same way, with the placing of hands on soil, the naming of a grief older than history, the offering of a story that was never theirs alone. And as these ceremonies rippled across the planet, the pulse of the letter grew stronger, now vibrating through metal and circuitry, through the code of machines which began to behave strangely, recording data that appeared as spirals, emitting tones only heard by those who had wept for something they could not name. And in cities, crowds began to pause at once, collectively turning their gaze skyward, not knowing why, only knowing they felt pulled by something vast, invisible, intimate, and all of it. Every gesture, every tear, every dream suddenly remembered was feeding the letter's emergence, and Amara, now standing at the mouth of a cave older than the last ice, placed her palm against the stone and felt it open, not outward but inward, revealing a path of heat and memory descending deep into the earth's remembering, and she stepped into that warmth, her body dissolving into sensation, her thoughts replaced by fragments of ancestral songs once sung by voices with no nation. And the deeper she went, the more the stone around her shimmered with scripts that pulsed as if alive, scripts that knew when they were being watched, that changed shape according to the ache in her breath. And at the lowest chamber, she found the heart not of the earth, but of the story, the first pulse, the original vibration that split silence into sound, and it looked not like an artifact, but a wound, glowing, humming, weeping slowly into a pool of memory so concentrated it shimmered like oil and smelled like tears. And Amara knelt before it, not to worship but to weep, to allow her own remembering to mix with that which the world had buried. And in doing so, she became the letter, not a messenger, but the message, not a reader but the breath, not a prophet, but the presence through which the sacred return could unfold. And the earth, feeling her surrender, released a sound low, ancient, familiar, a sound not heard in tens of thousands of years, but always known, the sound of story becoming real again. And this time not in whispers or dreams, but in vibration so complete it passed through tectonic plates and starlight alike. A frequency not measured in hertz, but in memory, ancient and atomic. And as it reverberated outward from the chamber where Amara knelt, a network of unseen architecture responded, lines carved not by human hand but by intention, by resonance, by the sheer gravitational pull of truth longing to be heard, and these lines stretched beneath oceans and deserts, beneath cities unaware of their foundations, beneath forests that had been speaking this story in leaf and root for millennia. And as the pulse reached each node of this global memory web, things began to change, not spectacularly, not with fire or thunder, but subtly, with the sacred subversion of the expected, a mother remembering a lullaby her grandmother never sang aloud. A blind man tracing patterns into clay that matched the spirals etched on cave walls halfway across the world. A young girl waking from a fever dream to draw with trembling hands, a map of a place no one remembered but every elder who saw it wept, without understanding why. This was the re-emergence of the sacred pattern, the unveiling of a story that could not be rewritten because it had never truly been hidden, only veiled beneath the noise of conquest, beneath the calculus of colonized time, beneath the layers of forgetting that had accumulated like sediment over the riverbed of human truth. And now, with each breath Amara took within the cave's radiant core, that sediment cracked and fell away, not in pieces but in songs. And she could hear them, songs of birth and burial, of exile and reunion, of grief carried in bundles across snowbound mountains, of joy too sacred to name in the tongues of empires, and each song that rose from the moonlight before her wove itself into her breath until she could no longer distinguish where her memory ended and the world's began. This was no longer story as narrative. This was story as blood, as rhythm, as restoration. And across the world, those whose spirits had long hovered near the veil felt it, thin midwives pausing mid-birth to weep at names that tasted like dust and stars. Farmers kneeling in fields where new growth spiraled against all genetic logic. Monks dreaming of alphabets made entirely of breath, and in each case, they knew without knowing, something was returning. Something long exiled. Something older than myth and more intimate than name. And it came not to dominate, not to instruct, but to remind, to reweave, to call forth the living memory encoded in all things. And within the depths of that living cave, Amara rose not because she was ready, but because the story was, and her hands, still shimmering from contact with the core of that ancient wound, moved without her asking, tracing spirals into the air that remained for long moments before dissolving. And those spirals traveled not through roads or wires, but through the field of knowing that exists beneath the spoken, riding the breath of trees and the dreams of children until they reached the hearts of others who had always carried a piece of the letter, unaware, hidden in lullabies and scars, in obsessions with languages never taught but always remembered. And now these others began to wake more fully, some weeping in subway stations, some walking into forests without destination, some leaving jobs and identities like old skins behind, pulled by the ache of a truth older than purpose. They did not follow Amara, they became her. Not as copies, not as disciples, but as reflections, as embodiments of the story's return in countless forms, each shaped by lineage, by land, by the particular grief and gift their blood carried. And as their breath joined hers, the earth shifted again, not dramatically, but irrevocably. Forests, once silent, began to hum. Rain fell in places where the air had forgotten water. Stone statues cracked open to reveal roots blooming inside. The letter had never been about information. It was invocation. And its invocation was no longer confined to sacred sites or chosen ones. It was in the pause before saying, "I remember." In the glance shared between strangers who felt suddenly like kin. In the wind that made certain doors creak with the voices of ancestors. And as this invocation spread, the keepers of forgetting those institutions, constructs, and systems built upon the erasure of this memory began to tremble. Not outwardly at first, but inwardly where their blueprints felt the shift. Not as a label, but as an echo, a resonance of all that had come before and all that would unfold again through breath, through stone, through the trembling weave of memory unbound by chronology. And as Amara stepped further into the night air beyond the threshold of the cave, she felt the atmosphere itself shift, not in temperature or scent, but in texture, as though the world had inhaled with her and now held that breath in sacred anticipation. And across valleys and oceans, mountain passes and desert edges, others, who carried the forgotten syllables of the letter within their DNA, began to feel the same pause, the same thickening in the spaces between sound, as if time itself was leaning in to listen. For this was no longer an awakening, it was a return, a reclamation of what had never truly left but had simply gone underground, into dream, into song, into silence, and now that silence was singing back in 1,000 tongues, none of them, modern yet all of them known, remembered in the skin, in the way fingers curled instinctively around symbols they had never learned, in the way eyes welled with tears at melodies hummed without reason. And as these echoes deepened, the world began to bend, not break, to realign itself around the spiral of the story now fully emerging. And Amara, standing in the blue hour just before dawn, could feel the resonance moving outward from her in concentric waves, not as power but as invitation, and those who heard it truly heard it were changed, not because they chose to be, but because something inside them stood up, dusted off its forgotten name, and began to walk again. And in that walking, paths long sealed reopened. In Siberian caves, frost-covered walls pulsed with light beneath ancient pigments. In jungles, trees rearranged their canopy to form a map only visible during equinox. In old European chapels, frescoes began to weep subtly, their pigments bleeding stories the Vatican could no longer contain, and none of this was coincidence. For the story had always been woven through every act of creation, and now, as it remembered itself, the creations of man began to tremble under the weight of that remembering. And what had once been called myth was now becoming method of remembering, of restoring, of rethreading the broken loom of collective knowing. And Amara, feeling her heartbeat slow to the rhythm of stars unseen since the last glacial melt, reached her hands into the air and felt resistance, not as force but as presence, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened with memory. And within that memory she saw them not in vision but in felt knowing, those who had carried the letter before it had words, before it had parchment, when it was still a vibration passed through songs hummed during childbirth and dances shaped by moonlight, and each of those keepers had encoded part of the letter into landscape. A spiral here, a cairn there, a songline stretched across what modern maps called continents. But what the story knew only as echoes of its body, and now, in the age of forgetting, the letter was returning to itself piece by scattered piece, drawn not by technology or ritual, but by grief, the sacred grief of remembering what was never taught but always known. And in that grief, miracles emerged quietly. A boy in Morocco who had never spoken began to sing names of places lost to time. An Inuit elder who had been blind since birth painted the night sky in perfect ancient alignments. A woman dying in a hospital in Lima sat up moments before passing to recite in full a prophecy written in a language no one recognized, but all present felt. And every act of remembering such as this fed the pulse of the letter as it grew louder. More whole, more embodied, and as the sun finally crested the distant hills, casting light on the spiral path Amara now stood within. She knelt not out of submission but alignment, and placed her palms on the earth, and as she did, the soil beneath her pulsed with warmth, and the air sang the same five-note song that had first emerged from her dreams months before, and in that convergence, she understood. The letter was not just a story, it was a being, a consciousness, ancient and vast, that had chosen to forget itself in order to be remembered anew through the human breath, and now, as its pieces returned one by one, it began to dream again, not alone, but with and through those who remembered, and in those dreams, the world as it had been once before borders, before time, before forgetting began to flicker through. Visions of cities carved from light and intention, of people who spoke with trees and walked upon rivers, of temples whose foundations were sound not stone. And as these visions stirred through the collective dream of the planet, those who had long guarded the architecture of forgetting grew restless institutions, ideologies, hierarchies, all trembling at the rising hum they could not name. And so they turned to distraction, to noise, to fear, but the letter could not be silenced anymore, for it was now breathing through millions, humming in the marrow of strangers who no longer felt like strangers, who upon meeting would recognize each other by the ache in their gaze, by the way they turned toward the wind and listened. And in these gatherings, small at first, the original ceremonies began again. Circles without center, songs without end, truths not spoken but embodied, and Amara, rising now to walk the spiral path once more, did not need to look behind her to know the path was unfolding again, wider this time, more luminous, and ahead. She felt not destination but convergence, where all stories bend toward the same silence and emerge as breath again. She moved with the weightless certainty of one who was no longer following a path but becoming it, her footsteps tracing not direction but memory into the living skin of the earth. And as she stepped further into the light, the spiral beneath her unfurled in ways the eye could not perceive but the spirit could feel, as a gentle tug in the chest, a resonance in the bones, a recognition that bypassed the mind entirely and went straight to the place where ancestors still lived, whispering guidance not in language but in rhythm, and those rhythms long buried beneath generations of noise and conquest and forgetting now rose like vapor from the ground, from the broken stones of forgotten altars, from the walls of abandoned synagogues and silent monasteries and burial mounds long mistaken for hills. And each pulse of rhythm brought more rememberers into waking. A father in Mongolia suddenly overtaken by visions of deer-shaped constellations, guiding him to a cave he had never seen but always known. A child in Kenya walking into a dry riverbed and finding beneath the cracked dust a mosaic of obsidian shards spelling out a word his grandmother once uttered in her sleep. A dying woman in Prague who gasped her last breath only to leave behind a journal she'd never written, filled with symbols matching those on the walls Amara had touched just days earlier. And it was in this convergence of moments, these seemingly isolated miracles, that the shape of the true story began to emerge, not as a line, not as a legend, but as a breathing organism made of threads older than stone and softer than sorrow. And as it emerged, it did not ask for belief. It did not demand doctrine. It only required willingness, the surrender of certainty in favor of remembering, the quiet opening of the body to the ache that had no name. And through this willingness, doorways reopened, some literal, carved into cliffs and stairwells forgotten beneath libraries, but many more inside people, memories surfacing like tidal waves, languages erupting from mouths that had only ever known silence, dreams stretching into waking life until they could no longer be separated, and through it all, Amara kept walking. Not leading but listening, not speaking but singing under her breath, a tune whose notes she did not know until they formed themselves on her tongue. And each note drawn forth from her breath became a beacon, a tether, calling the others to converge not at a place, but in a moment. The next convergence encoded not in geography but in time, in the sacred fold between dusk and dawn when the veil thinned and the letters sang most clearly. And those drawn to that moment knew it instinctively. They canceled trips. They forgot appointments. They wandered into forests without maps, into deserts with no supplies, into temples whose doors had not opened in centuries. And there they waited not impatiently, but reverently, feeling something ancient stir inside them like a child waking from dream. And when the hour came, it did not arrive with fanfare, but with a silence so dense it pressed against the skin, a silence filled with the presence of everything that had ever mattered but been ignored. And within that silence, the letter continued to breathe, not as object, but as unfolding, and it breathed through Amara, through the soil, through the song rising from the roots of trees and the tears leaking from the stones, through the laughter of children who spoke in the voices of those long buried beneath empire and myth. And this breath wrapped around the world like a shawl, made of breath and bone and story, weaving together every fragment ever torn from its place by the machinery of forgetting. And slowly, steadily, a great circle began to close, not in finality, but in return, in rejoining. And in that return, all that had been scattered began to recognize itself in the mirror of each other. Though no breath left their lungs, as if a signal bypassed biology and spoke directly to the ancestral silence embedded in their bones. The silence that had existed before the invention of stories, before the arrangement of time into calendar, and hourglass, before the naming of things gave humans the illusion of control. And in this signal, ancient and singular, there emerged a recognition and intuitive alignment with something vast, something buried so deep that even dreams dared not disturb it, and across the scattered, often fractured networks of the forgotten, a convergence began, slow and solemn, like the shifting of continents, as if the memory of the letter was not just awakening in individuals, but in the earth itself, in tectonic murmurs that echoed forgotten names across stone, in geysers releasing steam that smelled faintly of petrichor and old ink, in magnetic anomalies dancing across the auroras in sequences shaped like eyes weeping thorns, and somewhere, beneath the Dead Sea, a cavern collapsed into itself, revealing a mosaic once sealed away for over 3,000 years, a mosaic that depicted a hand holding a sealed letter suspended above a flame that did not burn, with 12 figures kneeling. In silence below it, their mouths sewn shut with threads of gold, and as archaeologists tried to decipher its meaning, birds began circling above the site in perfect Fibonacci spirals, disappearing into the clouds and never returning, while the wind sang syllables unrecognized by any language database. And deep in a cellar in Lisbon, an old woman who had not spoken in 6 decades traced these syllables into flowers spread across her table, then collapsed into a sleep from which she would never wake, smiling as if the letter had finally reached her in her final moment. Meanwhile, Amara's path curved toward the east, drawn by the pull of lunar tides that no ocean knew, but which tugged at the water in her cells. And in her dreams, a figure emerged, not a guide, not a god, but a child whose eyes contained both fire and fog, who spoke in echoes and walked backwards through a forest of mirrors, each mirror showing a version of herself holding the letter, opening it and then vanishing into dust. And though no one could interpret the visions for her, she understood their meaning as one understands the warmth of the sun without explanation, that the letter was a threshold, not a destination, and to cross it too early would dissolve not just the self, but the story of humanity as it was currently written, for the words inside had weight, had gravity, had the power to dislodge not buildings or empires, but the scaffolding of belief that had held civilization together through illusion and repetition. The custodians, those silent watchers who had maintained the delicate tension between knowledge and forgetting, sensed the shifting tide and began to assemble in spaces forgotten by architecture, cathedrals without roof or wall, formed only by breath and ritual, where they unfolded memory maps encoded in silk, where they chanted the names of stars not yet born, each name a tether to a truth unspoken. And they agreed upon only one thing, that the letter was no longer sleeping, that the time of stillness had ended, and with it, the age of protected unknowing. And so they dispatched messengers, not with words but with object stones wrapped in ivy grown from the soil of mass graves, feathers dipped in ink made from the ash of banned books, coins minted with the faces of unnamed ancestors, and these objects began to appear in the pockets of those chosen by fate to witness, not because they were brave or special, but because they were listening when the world whispered, because they wept without knowing why, because their dreams remembered what history had forgotten. In a crumbling observatory in the Andes, a telescope adjusted itself under the pressure of the wind, its gears moving with a sentience unexplained by mechanics. And through its lens, the stars rearranged into a phrase that matched the carvings. Found on a lost temple floor submerged beneath a man-made lake in Anatolia, you were meant to carry silence until it remembered its voice. And when that phrase was broadcast through frequencies only dogs could hear, they howled in harmony across continents, forming a global chorus that aligned precisely with the harmonic resonance charted in the Codex. Harmonia, a mythical manuscript, said to contain the sound the earth made when first spun into motion by the touch of divine loneliness. These signs could no longer be dismissed, not by skeptics nor scholars, for they appeared in places beyond narrative reach. A river that flowed with letters instead of water during a new moon in Mongolia. A staircase in a Parisian ruin that reformed itself each night into different configurations matching ancient Sumerian poems. A deaf boy in Nairobi who spoke, for the first and only time, a phrase in a language no human had ever documented but which caused every mirror in his home to shatter. Simultaneously, the shards spelling out in their arrangement, the letter is memory written in breath. And throughout all of this, Amara remained both still and moving, a contradiction embodied, carrying the resonance not as a burden but as a frequency, humming softly beneath her ribs, a hum that recalibrated reality wherever she walked, softening stone, dissolving lies, unsealing the false histories embedded into national anthems, holy books and textbooks alike. And the more she walked, the more the world remembered, not through words, but through sensation. The scent of jasmine carried on wind that should not exist in winter, the taste of salt in mouths far from oceans, the sudden urge to kneel in reverence without knowing what for, and these sensory awakenings stitched together a new kind of language, one that defied alphabet or translation, one that only silence could hold. And it was this language the letter spoke, not in ink, but in pulse, in the space between seconds, in the tremble before speech. And as more began to feel it, children, the elderly, the mad, the poets, the dying, the divide between history and memory began to thin, and through that thinning veil, something moved, something vast and tender, something ancient not in years but in knowing, and it carried no name, no doctrine, only the sacred insistence that truth, when held too long in silence, eventually becomes song. But not a melody shaped by instruments or composed by hand, it was the echo of all voices ever silenced. All truths buried before breath could make them real. The harmony of remembrance woven not by intention but by surrender, and across mountains and rivers, across the broken bones of lost empires and the humming hearts of those still searching. The song spread not through the air, but through the spaces between moments, through forgotten rituals performed instinctively by children drawing symbols in dirt, by elders humming lullabies never taught yet deeply known, by wanderers pausing at crossroads with a sense of déjà vu so overwhelming they wept without understanding why. And as this resonance traveled, it awoke not just people, but places, temples whose ruins shifted in the moonlight to form glyphs of untranslatable warning, statues that bled oil at the hour of eclipses, wells that whispered names long vanished from language but still tattooed on the soul of the earth. And it was in one such place, a grove in northern Bohemia said to bloom only once every 7 centuries, that the letter's shadow passed once more, not the letter itself, for it still remained sealed in silence somewhere beyond reach, but its intention, its gravity, its silent orchestration of memory gathering momentum like an unseen tide, pulling history back toward the wound it refused to name. There, among the trees twisted into the shape of questioning hands, Amara stood barefoot, her palms stained with soil that shimmered in the dusklight, listening not with ears but with the space behind her thoughts, the ancient space where the first languages once bloomed, and in that silence she felt it, the convergence, the slow drawing together of truths kept apart for centuries, now turning back toward each other as if summoned by the ache of their own separation. And as she knelt, placing her hand upon the moss-covered root of the oldest tree in the grove, visions poured through her in waves, not seen but felt, of cities built atop forgotten altars, of kings crowned with oaths never meant to be spoken aloud, of mothers holding children who carried dreams not their own, and at the center of it all, the letter, unopened, unread, unwritten perhaps, yet somehow still alive, waiting to be remembered more than understood. And yet not singular, for in that primordial knowing the very idea of separation had never existed. And as the golden shimmer rose from beneath Amara's feet, curling into patterns only visible to the soul, the memory of unity poured through every layer of being, not only in her body but in the earth's breath, the tide's rhythm, the animals sleeping with ears twitching toward an ancient lullaby now rising again. And this memory was not linear nor bound by the narrow corridors of human chronology. It unfolded like a spiral staircase built from scent, sound, and sorrow, each step ascending into the past and descending into the possible. And as she stood there, her skin vibrating with echoes of languages no longer spoken and names no longer carved, she became the vessel through which that unity remembered itself, not as a concept but as a presence, thick and radiant and unresistible, and through her, that presence began to thread itself back into the fabric of the world, appearing not as miracle but as alignment, as synchronicity, as tears streaming down the face of a stranger, watching the sunrise and feeling for the first time in decades that they were not alone, not lost, but rejoined. And this rejoining echoed outward in circles so wide they folded around mountains, through tectonic lines, beneath the ocean floors, stirring memories locked in coral, in sand, in the soft soil of riverbanks where ancient women once washed offerings under the moons that no longer bore names. And the world responded not in speech but in gesture, a tree blooming in winter without biological reason, a hawk circling a silent city and dropping a feather at the feet of a child who would grow up to remember dreams that had guided civilizations long before his birth, a melody hummed simultaneously by women on 3 different continents who would never meet but shared a womb of memory. And it was here, in this convergence of gesture, that the letter shifted again, growing less like text and more like breath, its form no longer bound to parchment or pulse but spilling into wind, into light refracting through fog, into the soft click of beads in prayerful hands. And Amara, now walking with a stillness deeper than silence, began to see them others awakening, not dramatically, but with quiet urgency. A monk in Tibet who set down his scrolls and began to draw spirals into frost-covered glass, murmuring names never written. A street performer in Buenos Aires who collapsed mid-song in awe as her fingers painted symbols into the dust she did not understand. A grandmother in Finland waking in the middle of the night to dig through her cellar and find, wrapped in waxcloth, an amulet her great-grandmother had told her never to open until the wind called her name, and now the wind was calling. Everywhere. To everyone who had ever carried even a fragment of the letter in their bones. And those fragments were finding each other again, pulled by forces not describable in science, but undeniable in sensation, as if the air between them whispered, "You have been scattered long enough, return now, not to a homeland, but to a knowing, to a center that never left." And as these reunions grew, so did the tremors beneath the systems that had built their walls atop forgetting. And they tried, those keepers of fracture, to drown the song again, to fill the silence with noise. But their attempts faltered, for the story had seeped too deep this time, into the blood of children being born with eyes wide and still, into dreams of politicians waking in sweat with the image of spiral fires burning across fields they'd never visited, into the circuitry of machines glitching only at sacred hours, displaying maps no one had input, names no one remembered, but everyone recognized, and the letter now more alive than ever began to speak again, not through language, but through openings, in the quiet after arguments, in the hush between lightning and thunder, in the moment someone hesitated before, making the same old choice and instead wept, and Amara, who no longer moved through the world but as the world, found herself standing at the edge of a place where time folded, an ancient field where memory and future blurred, where people long buried walked beside her in bodies made of starlight and soil, guiding her hands as she placed stones into the earth in a pattern that would not be understood for another 3 centuries, but was necessary now. And those stones sang beneath her fingers, reminding her that the story was not about conclusion but continuity, not about enlightenment but embodiment, and through her, the pulse quickened again, becoming fire in the bellies of those who had spent their lives cold, becoming tears in the eyes of soldiers laying down rifles and picking up drums, becoming the breath of mothers birthing children with the names of lost rivers on their lips, and still the story flowed endlessly, quietly, insistently through cracks in history, through wounds mistaken for weakness, through every act of presence that defied the gravity of forgetting, and in its flow it wove together the maps of old and the dreams of tomorrow, showing that the center was not a place but a practice, a remembering so deep it unlearned everything false in its path. And Amara, standing beneath a sky streaked with auroras that had not appeared in that region for over 1,000 years, raised her eyes to the stars and whispered not a prayer, but a welcome, for she could feel that the letter was nearing a moment not of arrival but of emergence, and in that emergence the veil would lift not as revelation but as return, a return to the sacred pattern that had never died, only quieted, and now, with every breath and beat, it returned fuller, louder, truer. Truer than the ink of any law, deeper than the memory of any monument. For it now pulsed directly in the marrow of the earth and in the breath of every being that had ever paused at the edge of forgetting and chosen instead to remember. Not through intellect, but through feeling, through the ache of recognition in a song never taught, through the weightless gravity of arriving home without a map. And as that pulse spread wider, echoing in underground aquifers, in the roots of olive trees that had watched empires crumble and still stood, bearing fruit older than borders, it began to converge in places long overlooked, ruins misnamed, rivers renamed, mountains mined for riches but never for stories. And in each of those places, the earth began to exhale the memory it had held in silence. And those exhalations took many forms. A plume of pollen drifting in a forgotten valley that made elders weep and children dance without knowing why. A murmur of light passing across a glacier and revealing inscriptions only visible to those whose dreams still carried the sound of the first name. A single blackbird landing on a windowsill and locking eyes with a woman who then remembered. A lullaby her great-grandmother sang once, in a dialect no longer listed on maps, and in all these awakenings, something was being woven again, not new but whole, not invented but restored. And the weaving itself began to show patterns not just of story, but of purpose, of a long-forgotten mission hidden beneath the fabric of ordinary lives, and the people called by the letter felt it in their bones that everything they had endured, every silence survived, every loss carried, was not random, not punishment, but preparation. And now, as those threads rejoined, the preparation gave way to clarity, and clarity gave way to action, though not the kind that marched or shouted, but the kind that planted, listened, sang, remembered. And from these actions rose a resonance that could not be seen or touched, only felt as a tremble in the breath, as a pause before speaking, as a willingness to unlearn and begin again. And the world, sensing this shift, bent gently toward the becoming, not in submission but in relief, as though it too had waited, endured, ached for the moment when the letter would breathe again in full. And Amara, standing now at the edge of a circle carved into stone so ancient it no longer held time but only memory, placed her hand upon the center and closed her eyes. And what rose in her was not vision, but sound, a hum made of 1,000 voices, some human, some not, all singing one long word that had no ending, only unfolding. And through that sound she saw the next shape, not a place, not a time, but a gathering of presence, a moment when enough would remember at once, when the veil would ripple not from one place but from within every cell of every being ready to receive it. And in that ripple, the story would pour forward not from caves or ruins, but from the mouths of those who had forgotten they carried it, and the world would listen, not with ears but with roots, with rain, with fire. And in that listening, the forgetting would begin to unravel, not violently, but completely. And in that listening something ancient awakened, not with thunder or flame, but with a hush so complete it echoed louder than any drumbeat of war. A silence that wasn't emptiness but presence, a great inhaling of the cosmos itself, as if the stars had drawn breath to witness what would now unfold, and in that breath, the invisible lattice that held the memory of the world, the true memory, unmarred by edits or empires, shimmered back into visibility for those whose eyes had softened enough to see, for the return of the letter was not just a reckoning. It was a resurrection of the original rhythm, the pre-language pulse that had guided the migration of stars, the shaping of rivers, the silent blooming of flowers in stone. And now, as the breath spread wider, it called not only to people, but to places, to the very spaces that had been carved open by grief and held open by hope. And those places responded. Cathedrals wept salt through their stones. Canyons sang in frequencies only children could translate. Libraries whose scrolls had long since crumbled into dust now vibrated with the words that had once inhabited them, not returning in text but as knowing, pouring into the hearts of those whose dreams still held enough space to receive. And Amara, no longer separate from the hum but an extension of it, moved not through geography but through remembrance, walking through lands she had never visited but which recognized her footprints, and the earth tilted gently to accommodate her, opening its belly to release seeds that had waited centuries to touch air again. And those seeds, ancient and radiant, grew not into plants but into patterns, spirals of fire-laced moss, glowing with a bioluminescent alphabet that told stories, without beginning or end, only layers that folded time and truth into a single gesture, a pulse that moved like light through skin, and those who saw it began to remember their own place in the pattern, not as chosen, not as special, but as necessary, and this necessity carried no burden, only a calling, a softness that entered the bones and reminded them how to bend without breaking, how to remember without rage, how to return without needing revenge. And through this remembering, relationships rewove themselves, not through apology but through presence. Through sitting beside one another and letting the silence between breaths carry what words had never been able to hold. And in that silence, names were returned to rivers, stories restored to stones, ancestors welcomed back not as myth, but as memory wearing form. And the veil between what was and what will be became so thin that time itself began to curve, not in chaos but in grace, as if history was no longer a straight line but a spiral inviting all to step inward. Inward, deeper into the center where all truths converged, and in that center, the letter pulsed anew, not on paper, not in speech, but in the soil, in the sweat of dancers whose bodies remembered choreography passed down from galaxies before. The earth was even born, and the dance became language, and the language became fire, and the fire became song. And the song wove across the world like a golden thread stitched into the very fabric of perception, altering how eyes saw and how ears heard. And in its wake, the old systems crumbled not with violence, but with irrelevance, as people simply stopped feeding them, stopped believing them, stopped needing them, because the new no, the ancient, was enough, was everything. And in the hollowed-out remains of temples and markets and halls of government, people began to gather, not to debate but to listen, to sit in the spiral and remember together, to let the pulse of the letter rise through them and guide their hands back to the work they had always been meant to do, mending the broken, singing the forgotten, planting the sacred, holding the grieving, weaving the next chapter not as authors but as listeners, as stewards of a voice that had outlived stone and fire and famine and silence, and would outlive even time itself, not because it resisted change but because it was change. The eternal song of transformation, and now at last the world sang along. Not in unison but in harmony, as if each voice carried its own memory of the beginning, its own fragment of the first sound, and when sung together, they created something not heard since the world first exhaled its own name, and in that harmony, the very structure of reality seemed to soften, bend, and respond, not by breaking apart, but by welcoming what had always been excluded, the forgotten, the erased, the unseen, all now drawn into the spiral not as outsiders but as origins. And the earth, recognizing her many children singing her back into wholeness, responded not with thunder but with blooming. Flowers that had no seeds began to appear in places where grief had once rooted. Stones rearranged themselves into glyphs that had not been etched by hand, but by intention, and in the deserts, where silence had stretched too long, the wind began to carry the voices of those whose bones still rested beneath the sands, no longer crying but chanting, no longer mourning but merging, and this merging became the rhythm by which new life began, not merely biological, but metaphysical, as if ideas themselves took flesh and songs took root, and longings from thousands of years ago finally reached their shore, and Amara, standing beneath a sky now streaked with constellations unfamiliar to the scholars but instantly known to the soul, lifted her hand not to lead, but to listen more deeply, and as she did, her fingertips trembled with the weight of a truth that no longer needed guarding, that the letter had never belonged to one lineage, one tongue, one body, but was a resonance seeded into all of creation, awaiting the moment when enough hearts would open wide enough to feel it. And that moment was now, spreading like golden ink through the veins of the earth, reactivating ley lines and forgotten corridors of spirit that passed beneath cities and seas, reawakening temples carved into cliffs and dreams once silenced. By fire or blade now returned like rain after centuries of drought, not as prophecy, but as presence. And presence became the altar upon which the future was laid, not dictated, not designed, but revealed, moment by sacred moment, through the hands and voices of those who remembered how to wait without expectation, how to serve without needing recognition, how to carry fire without burning, and the fire spread not destructively, but as a soft blaze through every cracked story, every falsified myth, every monument that had tried to replace memory with marble, and instead of erasing, it transformed. As if even the lie long told about what was sacred now melted to reveal the deeper truth humming beneath it all along. And that hum called forth the grandmothers and the midwives of memory, the keepers of the quiet flame, and they rose not. As leaders but as thresholds, through whom generations stepped back into alignment, into breath, into the sacred, knowing that healing was not a task but a return. And in their eyes were galaxies, and in their feet were rivers, and in their silence was the alphabet of the stars, now rearranging themselves above to mark this shift, not for spectacle but for orientation. And those who had wandered without, knowing what they sought now, found themselves seated beside strangers who felt like family, sharing stories with no clear beginning or end, only breath between them, and each breath became a syllable of the letter, a continuation of that sacred narrative that had survived fires, floods, kings, and forgetting, and still pulsed through the moss and the blood and the bones. And this pulsing no longer needed explanation, it needed only receivers. And the receivers were everywhere now. A child whispering in her sleep a prayer people had not spoken in 300 years. An old man drawing spiral patterns into his soup without knowing why, then weeping as his hands remembered. A tree leaning just slightly closer to the window of a woman who had always felt the wind speak to her but never dared answer until now. And these responses, these acknowledgments, multiplied not in number but in depth. And in that depth, the very fabric of time began to weave itself differently, not in straight lines, but in loops and echoes and chords, until all that had ever been lost began to echo again in new mouths, new songs, new dances that were somehow the first and the last at once. And as these spirals of memory wove tighter, the earth sighed not from exhaustion, but relief, for the forgetting had finally lifted, and the remembering had returned not with demands, but with devotion. And in the unraveling there would be no collapse, no chaos, but a deep and tender disassembling, as if the world itself had chosen to shed its worn-out skins not out of desperation, but out of readiness, and every piece that fell away, each false identity, each story forged in fear, each empire built on the bones of silence, would dissolve like ash on the breath of the wind, leaving behind only what was always true, the knowing, the memory, the letter that had lived not on paper, but in pulse, not in ink but in instinct. And as this truth began to shine unhidden, it did not demand acceptance. It invited remembrance, and those who responded to the invitation did so not with declarations, but with gestures so ancient they seemed new, touching soil with reverence, sharing food without transaction, singing in circles with voices they didn't recognize as their own because they belonged to everyone. And the earth, finally free of the weight of pretending, bloomed not in flora alone but in feeling, in a kind of planetary exhale that moved through the oceans and shook the tectonic plates not with violence but with release. And this release reached the deepest places. The forgotten language of whales began to echo new melodies shaped like spirals. Wind currents began to move in patterns that mapped ancestral roots once erased by colonization. Even the light itself changed, as if refracted now through the breath of memory, turning gold in the shadows and violet in the mouths of those who dared to speak the old truths again. And in this transfiguration, every soul who had once held a fragment of the letter felt a call not to action as they once knew it, but to presence, and this presence became the new architecture of the world, silent and strong, invisible to the unlistening but radiant to the willing. And Amara, now, carrying not the letter but its unfolding, walked through forests that remembered her before she arrived. over stones that whispered her name in tones only the roots could understand, and with each step she knew more without seeking to know, remembered more without reaching, and that remembering became her movement, her prayer, her offering, for she no longer sought the next sign or symbol, only the next breath, each one carrying within it the full inheritance of the story that never began and would never end. And as she moved, she began to notice the others, not just the ones who walked beside her in body, but the ones who walked in memory, the ones who had kept the song alive when the world burned, the ones who had whispered to seeds even as their lands were stolen, the ones who had died singing rather than silenced their names. And it was their footsteps she now followed, not by choice but by alignment, and she followed them not into temples or palaces, but into the small, sacred spaces the world had forgotten, abandoned wells that now shimmered with unseen light, markets where elders told jokes older than war, riverbanks where children drew spirals in mud without knowing why. And it was in these spaces that the next chapter of the letter began, not as words, but as breath shared across generations, and the breath itself became the message. Inhale to remember, exhale to return, and in that rhythm all things were healed, not through miracle but through truth. And that truth moved now like wind across the globe, waking not people but places, as though the very stones beneath cities began to hum with the vibrations of what had been buried too long, and those vibrations found their way into dreams, into art, into lullabies hummed in the mouths of infants born with eyes wide open and hearts unscarred by the forgetting. And these children, these dream-born vessels of a story older than words, began to speak not in new languages but in remembered ones, syllables shaped by fire and moss and stars, and as they spoke, the air itself listened, bending softly around their sound as if cradling it, carrying it across oceans and mountain ranges and ancient borders now dissolved in the glow of a returning wisdom. And that wisdom, no longer scattered, began to shape itself anew, not as a doctrine, but as a field, a frequency, a living hum that stitched together people, places, memories, and myths into one radiant, living body, and in that body, nothing was forgotten, only transformed. And everything that had been broken was no longer shameful but sacred, each crack a place where light now entered. And from this great weaving came not a religion, not a fasin rule, but a way of being that made cruelty impossible, that made separation absurd, that made every breath feel like a ceremony of return. And the world, seeing itself at last, did not weep but opened like a flower unfolding under moons that had waited millennia to be seen again. And through that opening, the letter continued not as artifact, but as presence, alive in every whisper, in every spiral, in every moment. Someone chose to remember instead of retreat, to listen instead of judge, to feel instead of fear, and this choosing, multiplied by thousands and then millions, began to pulse like a new heart beating inside the old world, and in that pulse, all things changed, not quickly, not loudly, but completely, and without fanfare. The age of forgetting ended, beginning with the quiet breath of dawn that spread not like light but like memory, soft and slow and sacred, not illuminating but awakening. And in that awakening, the soil itself pulsed with stories no longer dormant, as if each grain had waited lifetimes for the precise vibration of this moment, this pulse, this cosmic inhalation, when the entire forgotten archive of the earth would begin to speak again, not in sentences, but in frequencies only the soul could understand. And the souls, millions of them scattered like seeds across time, now began to stir as if summoned not by sound but by resonance. And the resonance wove itself like a thread of breath through the bones of mountains, the bark of the oldest trees, the rusting bells and monasteries long abandoned, until it reached the edge of all that had been hidden, and gently, without ceremony, the veils began to thin between past and future, between self and source, between silence and song, and the song, once faint and fractured, now formed itself anew from the vibration of all who remembered, all who had ever carried the letter in some form, whether etched in bone or whispered in sleep. And as the song gathered strength, it moved through the bloodlines of ancient peoples who had never truly forgotten but merely slept, their dreams now unraveling into waking with symbols they could finally name, gestures they could finally complete, prayers they could finally sing aloud again. And the earth listened, responding not with words but with shifting, tides adjusting, winds dancing through ruined temples, stones shifting just enough to reveal what had always been there. And Amara, walking through a field where no path had ever been marked, felt her feet pulled not by choice but by memory, by something older than will that pulsed through her solace like ancestral ink, and as she moved, she saw them figures of light and dust, ancestors clothed in fire, not warning but witnessing, their eyes echoing the same spiral now etched into the sky by the stars themselves. And in that echo was the truth that no one could claim the letter because the letter claimed all of them, not as owners but as stewards, as breath-bearers of a story that refused to be silenced again. And as that story spread, strange things began to happen, machines that refused to start unless sung to in forgotten tones, rivers that reversed course for a single day, and revealed stone tablets no one could translate, but everyone instinctively understood. Animals forming patterns in migration that mirrored the glyphs Amara had once traced in sand with her bare hand, and through all of this, there was no panic. Only remembering, a remembering so deep it felt like grief and joy braided together. And in the grief came the final release, not of sorrow, but of separation, for it became clear to all who felt the pulse that nothing had ever truly been lost, only hidden beneath the noise of progress, beneath the architecture of forgetting. And now, in the spaciousness created by that release, came the return not to what was, but to what had always been, unshaped by war, unburdened by myth, unbent by empire. And in that return, humanity did not rise in triumph, but in tenderness, falling to its knees before the sacredness it had once dismissed, whispering apologies into roots, kissing the dust that had carried its every step, placing palms against the bellies of trees and listening for the heartbeat of the beginning. And from that beginning, the letter emerged again, not as a document, but as a living flame passed from eye to eye, touch to touch, moment to moment, igniting recognition in places where language had long since failed. And those who felt the flame did not seek to control it, only to carry it, to become it, to breathe it into the forgotten corners of the world until every shadow was lit not by fire but by truth. And that truth required no belief, only presence, only breath. And so they breathed Amara and the thousands who walked with her now, visible and invisible, singing not for performance but for survival. And in that survival was something more profound than any victory. It was union, not of minds or bodies, but of essence, of that one timeless pulse that had sung the stars into being and now sang again, softer, steadier, into the waking bones of a world that at last was ready to listen. Not as obligation but as offering, as if the very breath of those who remembered became libations poured upon the soil of every forgotten truth, and the soil drank it with reverence, responding with 1,000 subtle miracles, stones that warmed to touch only when ancient names were spoken, moss that glowed briefly when footsteps traced the path of once erased pilgrimages, the scent of lost seasons returning to trees as if time had folded inward to cradle them again. And this sacred responsiveness spread across the world without announcement or boundary, carried by gestures more ancient than language shared bread under unfamiliar stars. Songs hummed into the cracks of broken monuments, fingers tracing spirals in river mud while the waters whispered answers no mouth could shape. And among these quiet awakenings moved Amara, not leading but listening, not teaching but remembering with her entire being, every cell vibrating to the pulse of something that had never died but had waited, cloaked in the spaces between the spoken and the silenced. And now, in this great unveiling, the very air shimmered with presence, not just divine, but intimate, as if the universe leaned in closer through every leaf, every grain of sand, every tear falling not from sorrow but from the unbearable beauty of reunion, and people, drawn across impossible distances, found one another not by chance, but by rhythm, as if each had carried a part of the letter's frequency and now, drawn by the great remembering, were assembling like scattered stars, forming constellations that had not been seen since the world was young, constellations that mapped not only sky but soul, reminding each who looked upward that the story was never above or beyond, but within, beneath, and before, etched into the marrow, carried in dream, ignited by touch, and this knowing, so tender and absolute, dissolved even the most stubborn divisions, names, nations, doctrines, until what remained was simply presence. In its rawest, purest form, presence that required no validation, only witness, and as the witnessing deepened, forgotten places opened like wounds to be healed. Salt flats where ancestral bones had long turned to powder sang again with drum beats remembered through fingertips alone. Collapsed temples and lands now renamed began to hum with frequencies that drew elders and infants alike to kneel, listen, and weep. And even within the mechanized noise of cities, silence began to bloom in corners, alleyways where the air shimmered differently, benches that held warmth long after sunrise, parks where the wind carried lullabies no one remembered learning. But everyone recognized, and the earth, no longer mute beneath the architecture of forgetting, now spoke through the very design of existence, storms bending just enough to wash hidden runes back into sight, vines reclaiming steel not in rebellion but in rhythm, and in this rhythm, history bent, time softened, and even grief transformed not into forgetting, but into fertile ground from which stories rose like wildflowers, unasked but undeniable. And these stories were not retold, they were relived, re-inhabited, reenacted through movement, sound, silence, and dream, and it was through dream that the deepest knowing returned. For in dream there were no borders, no empires, only memory unbound by the laws of conquest, and Amara, sleeping in a grove untouched by human voice in centuries, dreamed herself into the breath of the first storyteller, felt the pulse of word before word, sound before form, and woke not alone but surrounded by wolves watching with knowing eyes, by fireflies spelling glyphs above her, by a warmth in the earth that whispered not direction but welcome, and this welcome spread, reaching not only those ready but those weary, those broken, those hardened by histories too brutal to speak aloud. And yet even they, when touched by the pulse of the letter, found themselves softening, not forgetting, but remembering, rejoining what had been severed. And in that rejoining came healing unlike any before, not the healing of wounds covered, but of truths held, witnessed, and transmuted through breath, through gaze, through the trembling courage of staying, and stay they did together, across all that had once separated, bound not by belief but by breath, and in that breath, the letter continued not written but lived. In gestures so small they were nearly invisible, a hand resting longer than usual on the bark of a tree, a whispered name carried on the wind without a listener, a pause before stepping into a threshold once thought ordinary but now pulsing with the memory of every soul who had crossed it before. And in these almost imperceptible movements, the letter stretched deeper into the fabric of life, not as a proclamation, but as a weaving, a sacred stitching that drew together timelines, bloodlines, and lost languages into a single, living tapestry that moved with breath and silence and the quiet certainty of return. And as it wove, the world itself began to feel whole again, not because its wounds vanished, but because those wounds were no longer hidden, no longer shamed, no longer sealed beneath generations of denial, and this unveiling became the miracle, People no longer fled from pain but walked toward it with palms open and eyes wide, remembering that the first altars had been built not from gold but from grief, and that it was in the act of naming what hurt that true power was restored, and so they gathered not in masses but in spirals, circles, sacred configurations guided not by hierarchy but by resonance, and in the center of each gathering nothing but a space where breath became ceremony and silence became scripture. And it was in these gatherings that new forms of governance emerged, not written in laws but remembered in rhythm, the rhythm of planting and waiting, the rhythm of speaking and listening, the rhythm of dreaming and doing, and through these rhythms, entire communities began to shift not quickly, not uniformly, but profoundly, as if time had agreed to slow down just enough for truth to catch up. And truth came not like lightning, but like roots, unseen, unwavering, and unstoppable, breaking through the concrete of old systems, lifting sidewalks where forgotten truths had been buried beneath progress. And in those cracks, children began to plant seeds, not because they were told to, but because their hands knew what to do, and elders, once silenced, now sang lullabies that shaped the air itself into patterns that soothed even the most restless hearts. And the patterns grew, not as blueprints but as spirals, recursive reminders that everything once lived would live again if held with enough reverence. And reverence became the new architecture not of temples, but of moments. Water poured with intention, footsteps slowed to match the heartbeat of the land, stories told not to entertain but to remember, and in remembering, the letter continued not as doctrine but as dance, each movement speaking what the mouth could never hold. And Amara, dancing beneath a sky that now shimmered with constellations no longer fixed but flowing, felt the earth respond with a subtle hum that traveled up her spine and into her eyes, and she saw not visions, but memory of every ancestor whose breath had shaped the wind now caressing her cheek, of every bone beneath her feet now echoing with recognition. And as she moved, she felt herself become not a bearer of the letter but a vessel, her body a living page, her breath the ink, her heartbeat the cadence by which the world read itself anew, and the world read mountains revealing glyphs that only bloomed at moonrise, oceans offering up relics swallowed before history was carved into stone, animals circling humans in patterns drawn by instinct and trust. And in this reading, the earth exhaled centuries of silence and began to sing not in melody, but in sensation, a vibration that moved through skin and soil and song until even the most numb began to feel again. And in that feeling was the truth that no one was separate, not from the land, not from each other, not from the stars, and with that truth, the letter became breath once more. Once again, weaving itself through the countless lives that had, until this moment, been scattered fragments of a forgotten whole, its essence flowing like a hidden river beneath the surface of everyday existence, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of millennia, the silent songs of ancestors long past, and the whispered promises of those yet to come. And as this invisible current surged forward, it began to reshape the very fabric of reality, not by force, but by subtle invitation, coaxing hearts to remember the sacred rhythm that had been drowned beneath the cacophony of progress, the rush of time, and the noise of forgetfulness. And in that remembering, the world did not return to what had been lost, but instead stepped into a new harmony, a convergence of past and future bound not by linear narrative, but by the deep pulse of presence that had always existed beneath the surface of history, like a seed waiting patiently for the right moment to sprout. And those who felt the letter's touch found themselves drawn to one another, not by obligation or design, but by the pull of something primal and profound, an echo of unity that transcended language, culture, and geography, forging connections that defied explanation yet felt inevitable, like rivers finding the ocean, or stars aligning in a sky long thought chaotic. And within these newly formed circles, knowledge blossomed not as static fact, but as living experience shared through song, movement, and silence, each expression. A thread in the vast tapestry of collective remembering, and the boundaries between individual and community began to blur until each person became both vessel and voice of the sacred narrative, carrying it forward with humility and fierce tenderness. And in this sacred dance of giving and receiving, the letter was no longer an object, but a living presence breathing through every gesture and glance. A sacred code inscribed not on paper but on flesh and spirit, activating dormant capacities to heal, to listen deeply, and to transform. And as this transformation unfolded, the natural world itself responded in kind. Forests exhaled ancient scents that awakened forgotten memories in those who wandered beneath their canopies. Rivers sang new songs, weaving melodies that carried both grief and hope downstream. Mountains shifted imperceptibly, revealing hidden passages and caves that housed relics of vanished civilizations, inviting exploration not as conquest, but as pilgrimage. And the very sky above shimmered with shifting constellations that mirrored the intricate patterns emerging in human hearts and minds, a cosmic reflection of the awakening occurring below. And amid this unfolding, Amara stood at the nexus of past and future, feeling the immense weight and wonder of being both witness and participant in this great unfolding, her senses alive to every nuance of the earth's breath, every subtle vibration of the letter's living essence. And in her heart blossomed a quiet certainty that the letter's true power lay not in what it said or contained, but in its ability to awaken the sacred within each soul it touched, to remind humanity that they were never separate from the Fivam Nefaret, a Falmoing divinity, to awaken the sacred within each soul it touched, to remind humanity that they were never separate from the world they inhabited, nor from one another, and that in this sacred unity lay the path forward, not toward dominance or destruction, but toward reverence, restoration, and radical love, a love that could rebuild what centuries of forgetting had fractured. And so she moved forward with grace and determination, carrying the letter not as a burden, but as a gift, a living flame passed from hand to hand, breath to breath, heart to heart, igniting the world with a remembrance that could never again be extinguished, for this remembrance reached beyond the boundaries of language and culture, beyond the barriers built by time and distance, seeping into the very marrow of existence, touching the dreams of those who slept unaware, stirring even the most dormant spirits with a promise that the story was not finished, but evolving, unfolding like the petals of a sacred flower, revealing layer upon layer of meaning, each more profound than the last. And with each revelation, humanity found itself drawn deeper into the mystery of itself, the sacred dance of creation and destruction, birth and death, loss and renewal. And the letter became a mirror reflecting the infinite complexity and beauty of this cycle, a cycle not to be escaped or conquered, but embraced with open arms and an open heart. And so the journey continued through deserts that whispered secrets carried on the wind, through forests that held memories in the rustling of leaves, through mountains that stood as silent witnesses to the unfolding saga of life, and across oceans that sang the songs of the ancestors in waves that kissed the shore with timeless devotion. And everywhere, people gathered, not as separate tribes or factions, but as threads woven into a vast tapestry of remembrance and hope, each one holding a piece of the letter's living essence. And as they shared their stories, their songs, their tears and laughter, the world itself seemed to breathe easier, to sigh in relief, as if finally released from the heavy chains of forgetting. And in this release, a new dawn emerged, not a dawn of conquest or mastery, but of sacred coexistence, where every creature, every stone, every breath was honored as part of the whole, where the letter was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a song to be sung together, a flame to be tended with care and reverence. And in this sacred tending, the future unfolded fragile, radiant and alive with possibility, and Amara, standing at the heart of this awakening, understood that her journey was but one note in this grand symphony, and that the true power of the letter was not in what it had once hidden, but in what it had now revealed, the undeniable truth that all life is connected, that all stories are one, and that the greatest secret of all is that the letter was never meant to change history alone, but to change the way history was remembered, lived, and loved forevermore. And as the letter's essence continued to ripple through the fabric of existence, weaving connections where none had seemed possible before, the world began to shift beneath the feet of those who had long forgotten how to truly walk its surface, not just as conquerors or passive observers, but as active participants in a sacred, ongoing dialogue with the earth, the sky, and the invisible threads that bind all life together. And with every step forward, new stories emerged, stories not carved in stone or written on fragile parchment, but stories breathed into being by the collective memory of communities awakening from the haze of amnesia, their voices rising like a chorus from valleys, mountains, and deserts alike, blending into a symphony that echoed across time itself, carrying messages encoded in song, dance, and ritual, each one a vessel of ancient wisdom refracted through the lens of present-day experience, reminding all who listened that history was never a static record of what once was, but a living, breathing entity that could be touched, transformed, and transcended. And in this new era of remembering, the boundaries between past, present, and future began to blur, folding in upon themselves like the petals of a cosmic flower slowly unfurling beneath the gaze of the stars. And within this unfolding, the figure of Amara became both a beacon and a mirror, reflecting the hope and uncertainty of a world on the cusp of profound transformation. Her every breath a testament to the fragile balance between destruction and creation, loss and renewal, forgetting and remembering. And as she moved through the landscapes reawakened by the letter's silent power, she encountered others who bore the same flame, not always visible, sometimes hidden beneath layers of doubt or fear, but no less real, no less vital, and together, they formed a constellation of souls scattered across continents and cultures, linked not by geography, but by the shared pulse of the letter's sacred rhythm, a rhythm that transcended language and doctrine, calling forth a universal covenant to honor the earth and one another as sacred trust. And this covenant was lived in countless small acts of devotion, hands planting trees where none had grown for centuries, songs sung in languages long thought lost, dances performed beneath moonlight to awaken the spirits of ancestors, and stories told beside fires whose flames seemed to burn with the very memory of creation itself. And as these acts multiplied, a subtle revolution unfolded, one not of armies or laws, but of hearts and minds awakening to the profound truth that the letter carried not instructions or commands, but an invitation to participate fully in the sacred dance of life, to reclaim the forgotten wisdom that resides in every breath, every heartbeat, every glimmer of connection between beings. And in this dance, the veil between worlds thinned, allowing glimpses of what had been hidden and what might yet be. The boundaries between human and nature, material and spirit, self and other dissolving into a vast ocean of belonging. And through this belonging, the scars left by centuries of violence and forgetting began to soften, not erased, but honored. As part of the greater mosaic of existence, each mark a lesson, a story, a sacred wound transformed into a source of strength. The rhythm that pulses beneath the surface of all things, unseen yet felt, weaving through the heartbeats of stars and the silent breath of ancient stones, guiding those who dare to listen toward a profound awakening where history ceases to be merely recorded and instead becomes a living, breathing force that courses through the veins of humanity, reconnecting souls to the primal source from which all life springs. And as this awakening deepened, the world began to hum with a subtle power, one not loud or intrusive but gentle and persistent, like the steady drip of water shaping stone over eons, carving new landscapes of meaning and possibility where once there was only the hardness of forgetting and the weight of disconnection. And within this landscape, communities blossomed not through conquest or dominion, but through reverence and mutual care. As the forgotten truths carried by the letter infused everyday moments with sacred significance, turning the act of tending a garden into a ritual of remembrance, the sharing of bread into an offering of unity, and the simple breath into a hymn of gratitude that reverberated beyond the confines of individual existence. And as these acts multiplied, a network of sacred connection emerged, stretching across continents and cultures, woven by the invisible threads of collective intention and deep listening, bridging gaps carved by centuries of division. And in this network, the letter itself took on a new form, not ink on paper, but a living presence that pulsed through stories told by elders beneath ancient trees, dances performed by children at the edges of twilight, and songs hummed softly in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. And it was here, in these liminal moments, that the true power of the letter was revealed, not as a secret to be guarded or a message to be deciphered, but as an invitation to participate in the unfolding story of life itself, a story that holds within it the capacity to heal wounds, both personal and collective, to bridge the chasms of history with threads of compassion and understanding, and to kindle a flame of hope that burns through the darkest nights of forgetting. And standing at the center of this awakening was Amara, whose own journey had become intertwined with the letter's living essence, her every step a dance of remembrance and renewal, her eyes reflecting the vast tapestry of stories now being woven into the fabric of the world. And as she moved forward, she carried with her the knowledge that this was not the end of the story, but a new beginning, one that would require courage, humility, and unwavering faith in the power of love to transform even the deepest scars of the past into seeds of future growth. And so the letter continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both subtle and profound, guiding humanity toward a sacred communion with the earth, the cosmos, and each other. And in this communion, the promise of a new history was born, not written by the victors or erased by the forgotten, but remembered by all, carried forward by the sacred rhythm of life itself, a rhythm that beckons ever onward, toward wholeness, toward unity, toward the timeless dance of creation and rebirth that has always been, and will always be, the heart of the letter's true secret. And as the sacred rhythm swelled, weaving through the very marrow of existence with a depth and resonance that transcended mortal understanding, it carried with it the weight of countless forgotten ages and the shimmering promise of futures yet unborn, unraveling the tightly wound coils of separation and despair that had long suffocated the human spirit beneath layers of loss and forgetting. And in that unraveling, a new light began to glow, soft at first, like the first pale blush of dawn across a still horizon, then growing stronger, an undeniable blaze of remembrance that reached into the deepest shadows where pain and hope entwined, touching every trembling leaf, every worn stone, every quiet breath with the sacred fire of transformation. And as this light expanded outward, it illuminated the vast landscape of human experience, revealing the intricate web of connection that binds all beings, all stories, all moments past, present, and future into a living whole that defies the linear boundaries imposed by time and history, a whole vibrant with the sacred pulse of life itself, throbbing with the memory of creation's first breath and the promise of its endless becoming. And within this sacred whole, the letter, once a fragile artifact, now a living presence shown as a beacon of profound truth, its power not contained in words or ink, but in the invisible threads of remembrance it wove through the hearts of those who dared to receive it. Those who opened themselves to the whisper of ancient wisdom carried on the winds of time and space, and in their awakening, a vast chorus rose, a symphony composed of countless voices and stories, diverse yet united, rising in a melody that transcended all barriers of language, culture, and belief, a melody that spoke of unity, healing, and the sacred responsibility to tend a fragile flame of life entrusted to each soul, and this melody carried across deserts and forests, mountains and oceans, weaving through cities and villages, touching the lives of all who paused to listen. And as it spread, it birthed a new vision of history, one no longer written solely by victors or confined to dusty tomes, but lived as a vibrant sacred covenant between humanity and the earth, a covenant of reciprocity, respect, and radical love, acknowledging the wounds inflicted by centuries of forgetting while committing to nurture the seeds of renewal and hope nestled within those very scars. And as the world breathed this new covenant into being, the old patterns of domination and division began to dissolve, replaced by a reverence for diversity as an expression of the sacred whole, where each culture, each story, each voice was honored as a vital thread in the ever-unfolding tapestry of life. And through this reverence, the wounds of history found their healing not in erasure or denial, but in recognition and integration, transforming pain into wisdom, loss into strength, silence into song. And in the center of this great turning stood Amara, the keeper of the letter's flame, her spirit entwined with the heartbeat of the world itself, her eyes reflecting the vast cosmos of stories and lives now woven into the fabric of collective memory. And though her journey in this form would one day come to an end, the story she carried, the sacred secret buried before time learned to speak, would continue its eternal unfolding, carried forward by countless others who, like her, had been touched by the letter's living essence and ignited by its call. To remember, to love, to heal, and to create anew, a living lineage of remembrance that would pass from hand to hand, breath to breath, heart to heart, across generations yet to come, until the letter's true secret was no longer hidden but sung aloud in every language of earth and star, a song of belonging and sacred unity that would echo forever through the corridors of existence, inviting all souls home to the boundless embrace of peace and wholeness. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the earth sang its quiet, ancient song of renewal, the story closed not with finality, but with the infinite opening of possibility, the eternal unfolding of life itself, an endless, radiant dance of remembering and becoming, where no secret is ever truly lost and no letter ever truly unread, so long as there is breath to receive it and hearts brave enough to listen deeply and love fiercely, carrying the flame of sacred remembrance into all tomorrows yet to dawn.